In the previous lesson, we practiced changing the duration of our videos. Now, we'll spice our project up a little by adding annotations, transitions, and behaviors. Open the attached exercise file, or you can start a new project and import the attached media. When you click Annotations, you'll see 6 tabs along the top: Callouts, Arrows and Lines, Shapes, Special, Sketch Motion, and Keystroke Callouts. For now, we'll keep it simple and use the Callouts tab. Within the Callouts tab, you have a style drop list. I'm going to change my style to All just so I can see every callout that's available. Since this would be the title, I don't want it to be a talking bubble type of look. I want something straight and simple. So I'm going to click and drag the text rectangle style over to my canvas. Or if you prefer, you could double-click the callout and you'll get the same result. There are quite a few things that happen once you add the callout. First, the callout automatically creates a new track 4 in our project, on the timeline. The callout's default duration is 5 seconds and starts on the timeline wherever your playhead currently resides. You can change this at any time, and we'll do that shortly. Now let's look at the callout on the canvas. Notice there are circles. These are the edit points. If I place my mouse anywhere within the callout but not on a circle, I get a 4-sided arrow. If I click and drag, I can move the callout to another area of the canvas. If I place my mouse on one of the circles, I get a double-ended arrow. If I click and drag, I can resize the length, width, or height of the callout. To the right of the canvas are the properties of the callout. These are broken into 3 tabs: Visual, Text, and Annotation. If you only see one property tab, click the callout on the canvas or timeline to activate it. If you don't see anything on the right of the canvas, click the callout on the canvas or timeline to activate it, and then click the Properties button. Let's double-click on the callout and type Peak 18 Camtasia Project, and then click outside of the rectangle to save that edit. Note, if you hit Enter on your keyboard after typing, it's just going to add a new line for text in the rectangle, and we don't want to do that. If you already did that, you could just click the undo icon or Ctrl-Z on your keyboard and try again. Now let's make the callout rectangle the width of the canvas. Click and drag the side circles until you reach both sides. Notice when you reach the end of the canvas, a yellow line appears. This is the canvas snapping guide that we added earlier. As a reminder, enable all your snapping guides from the View menu if you haven't already done this. With the rectangle the width of the canvas, I want to move the callout to the horizontal and vertical center of the canvas. Point your mouse over the callout until you get the 4-sided arrow, then click and drag the callout until you see yellow vertical and horizontal lines. Then just line up the callout with the lines. Now let's change the color of the callout rectangle. Click to activate it, then click the Annotation tab of the Properties. We'll keep the text rectangle shape, but notice this is a quick way to change the shape if you want it. With the fill, you could use solid or gradient. You could use the color slider, the eyedropper, or you could type in the hex number. If you have the RGB colors, click the Mode button to access that option. Notice an undo icon appears once you change the original callout color, so you can always go back to the original. I like the purple of the mouse in the fast typing video, so let's grab that with the eyedropper. Make sure Fast Clock on track 3 is disabled or hidden so we can see the fast typing video. First, make sure the callout is in edit mode. I can see the callout with the edit circles on the canvas as well as the properties to the right, so I know I'm in edit mode. Next, drag the playhead on the timeline over until you see the fast typing video on the canvas. Notice that the callout properties are still to the right of the canvas. Click the color drop-down, select the eyedropper, and click on the purple mouse. There's a few different shades of purple, so just pick whichever you like. Drag the playhead back to the callout on the timeline, and you can see we now have a purple triangle on the canvas. Next is the opacity. The default is 100%, meaning it's completely solid. Let's make it a little transparent and change it to 75%. You could use the slider or type the percentage in, whichever you prefer. The last edit we can make is the outline of the callout. The drop list gives your choices of a solid line or various dashes. Color drop-down works the same as the fill color drop-down we just worked with. Let's go with gray. Don't see the gray outline? That's because we need to change the thickness. Again, you can use the slider or enter a number. Let's just go with a thickness of 3. So if you don't want an outline for your rectangle, just put the thickness on 0. And finally, we have the opacity of the outline. I'm going to change this to 75% so it matches the opacity of the fill. Feel free to experiment with the colors and outline and opacity for your callout. Now let's go to the text properties of the callout. Here, you could change the font, the color of the text, if you want regular, bold, or italics, and the size of the text. The style options are underline and strike through. And finally, we have the text alignment choices. I'm going to change my font to Tomaha, keep it regular, and change the size to 120. The last tab is the visual properties of the callout. Scale is another way to resize the callout. We did this earlier by clicking the edit points of the rectangle and dragging it, but you can also do it here. Opacity is for the entire callout. We changed the fill and the outline opacities on the Annotation Properties tab, but this opacity is for the entire callout, including the text. Rotation. If you want to tilt the callout, click and hold the dot in the circle to see how the adjustments will look. You have the refresh icon next to each option you change. Next, you have position. Click and drag the callout around the canvas, and you'll see X, Y, and Z change. All zeros mean the callout is horizontally and vertically centered. We did this earlier by using the canvas snapping, which gave us the yellow guide to find the center. Finally, if there are any default effects on the callout you selected, they'll appear here in the properties. So this callout has a drop shadow. If you want to remove the drop shadow, just click the X. I'm going to Ctrl-Z, undo my drop shadow delete. By the way, you can add multiple effects to a callout. What if you want the drop shadow effect, but you want to make changes to it? Notice that there is an up arrow at the bottom of the callout track. Click the arrow and you'll see drop shadow. Click on the drop shadow and the properties are enabled. You could change the angle of the shadow, the color, offset, opacity, blur, and ease in, ease out. With the callout title, I want it to come in at 2 seconds. An easy way to get an exact point on the timeline is to click and drag the playhead because it'll show you precisely where it is. Now that I have the playhead on 2 seconds, I'm going to click and drag the callout so the beginning of it matches up with the playhead line. See how the beginning of the callout bumps up to the playhead line and stops? That's because we enabled the timeline snapping, specifically playhead snapping. Now let's start at the beginning of the timeline and see how our callout looks. It looks pretty harsh, just appearing at 2 seconds. So let's soften it up a little by adding a transition. Click Transitions. You'll notice there's a type drop menu. Again, I'll keep it on all. I want the callout to fade in. Click and hold Fade, and then drag it over the callout on the timeline. Notice when you drag the fade transition to the timeline, the ends of all the media, except the music, turn yellow. That's letting you know you can add the fade transition to any of these media. So drag it over the callout, and you should now get a green beginning. If you drag it over callout and you're closer to the middle of the callout, you'll add fade to the beginning and end. We want the callout to fade in and out. So if you don't have the green at the end of the callout, simply click and drag fade again and towards the end of the track. When I place my mouse over the fade effect, it tells me the duration of the fade. I can easily adjust the duration by clicking the end of the effect. This is something you'll have to experiment with and adjust based on the transition you select. Since some transitions take more time than others, you might need to lengthen it. If I want to completely remove the effect, I just click on it. It turns from green to yellow, so I know it's in edit mode, and press delete on my keyboard. You don't have to use the same transition at the beginning and end of a media. Let's delete the beginning fade and change it to random dissolve. So now when I play it, the title dissolves in and fades out. Now let's add a transition between triangle dots and fast typing. You don't have to put your playhead anywhere specific on the timeline because you're going to drag and drop the transition right to where the two tracks meet. I'm going to use the fade through black this time. If I click the transition, it turns yellow, again letting me know it's active for edits. I can shorten or lengthen the duration just like I did on the callout. Let's go ahead and add another transition between fast typing and normal speed typing. And finally, let's add fade through black at the end of the normal speed typing. We added annotations and transitions, so now let's add some behaviors. Just like transitions, behaviors can be added to any form of media except audio. Let's add a behavior to our callout title. I'm going to drag my playhead on the timeline over the callout so I can see it on the canvas. Click Behaviors and you'll see the choices. I'll just start with the first option, drifting. Click and drag it over to the canvas onto the callout or directly to the callout on the timeline. Notice on the timeline, behavior added shows on the callout. If I click the expand arrow, I can see all effects on the callout. So if I don't want the drifting behavior, I can right-click and select delete. Notice if I keep the drifting behavior and then try the fade and the jump and fall, I now have 3 different behaviors on this callout. So you can have multiple behaviors on a media, but make sure it's not making the media too busy. I'm going to delete all the behaviors from the callout and just add pop-up. Since we added a behavior to the callout properties now has a behavior tab. This allows you to adjust everything on the behavior you selected, including changing the style altogether. The behaviors tab has 3 of its own tabs: in, during, and out. So you can even adjust the behavior to act differently at these 3 points. For this exercise, I'm going to keep pop-up and adjust the behavior points. For the in, I'll keep the style hinge, the movement spring, change the direction to top, and I'll leave the tension at 5. For during, I don't want the title to do anything, so I'll change the style to none. And for the out, I'm going to change the style to fade out, linear, and a speed of 85%. Now let's add another annotation with behaviors. This time, select the annotation that is text only and drag it to the bottom right of the canvas. Double-click the text and type in your name. Let's change some of the properties. Change the font to Arial. I'll use the color dropper to get the purple from the callout, and I'll keep the size at 70. I want to remove the shadow from the text. Go to the text on the timeline and expand the bottom so you can see drop shadow. Right-click and select delete. Now let's add a behavior. I'm going to add fade and then just adjust the properties. In, I want the type to be text center to out. The movement linear and the speed 85%. During, the style is none. And out, the style is fade out, type text out to center, and speed 85%. The text on the timeline, the text is track 5. I want the text to show after the title callout fades in, and I want the text to fade out before the title callout fades out. So I'll adjust the duration of the slide. Lesson takeaways. Make editing easier by enabling the snapping options from View. If you see a check mark, you've enabled the snapping. You can completely change the look of an annotation by experimenting with the annotation, text, and visual properties. Grab colors within your video to use on callouts. Click to activate the callout, then drag the playhead on the timeline to the media that has the color you want. Click the Fill Color box, select the eyedropper, and then click in the canvas on the color you want to sample. You can add transitions to any media except audio. And out, you can mix and match transitions on a single media. Behaviors can be added to any media type except audio. Use the properties of the behavior to change the in, during, and out effects. You can add multiple behaviors to your media.